Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask all of our internet viewers if they would like to send questions or comments at any time, simply to email us at speaker@heritage.org. For those here in-house, we always ask that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And we will, of course, post the program within the next day on our Heritage website for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion this morning is Dr. Niall Gardner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom and a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of Washington policy for over a decade now and is a leading expert on the U.S.-UK relationship. He is a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television. He received both his doctorate and undergraduate's degree in history from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Niall Gardner. Niall?
Thanks very much, John. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, to our in-person attendees here, to our online viewers, as well as to our viewers on C-SPAN. Today we're here to discuss a topic that is as unsettling as it is deeply important. Ever since the attack on the American diplomatic mission in Benghazi, Libya, on September the 11th, 2012, that left 4 Americans dead, including U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, the American people have been trying to get to the bottom of what happened that terrible night. How and why were certain decisions made? Why were U.S. military assets not deployed in a more timely manner to Benghazi? How did the administration come up with a false narrative of a YouTube video to explain the terrorist attack? And why did they continue to stick to that narrative in the days and weeks following the attack? As the House Select Committee on Benghazi begins its investigation into the events of that night and the administration's response, many questions remain unanswered. A lack of transparency and accountability, mixed with open defiance, have so far been the hallmarks of the Obama administration's response to congressional investigations into the terror attack. The House Select Committee, hopefully, will be able to find answers to those questions and bring closure to the families of the victims, as well as hold administration officials accountable for any failures. To help us identify the questions the Select Committee should be pursuing, as well as the prospects of success for their investigation, we have with us today a very distinguished panel. In the order they will be speaking, we have first off Peter Brooks, who is the Senior Fellow in National Security Affairs here at Heritage. Before joining Heritage, Peter served in the Bush administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Office of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Prior to that, he worked as a professional staff member on the House International Relations Committee. Peter has also served as an intelligence officer with the CIA's Directorate of Operations, focusing on global political affairs, arms control, and weapons proliferation. A decorated Navy veteran, Peter served on active duty in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, the Naval War College, and the Johns Hopkins University, and is currently pursuing his doctorate at Georgetown. He is a regular contributor to Fox News and CNN. In fact, I think, Peter, you may already have your PhD.
Yes, I do.
Congratulations. Next, we have Hans von Spakowski, a senior legal fellow with the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Additionally, he is manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative. His work at Heritage includes analysis of such issues as civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment, immigration, the rule of law, and government reform. Before joining Heritage in 2008, Hans served 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission, and prior to that as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. He is a graduate of MIT and the Vanderbilt University School of Law. He writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and Politico. And last but not least, Hella Dale is the Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy at the Heritage Foundation. Hella previously served as editorial page editor for the Washington Times, where she oversaw the paper's policy on presidential, congressional, and local politics, as well as foreign affairs. Hella joined Heritage in 2002 as Deputy Director of the Davis Institute for International Studies, eventually becoming Director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. Hella's work has been featured in numerous media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and the Weekly Standard. She is a graduate of the University of Copenhagen in Denmark and is a media fellow at the Hoover Institution. Hella's written numerous articles on the Benghazi issue and will continue doing so for the new heritage blog, The Signal, which launches tomorrow. And I look forward to Hella's remarks. With that, I'll hand over to Peter Brooks.
Thank
Peter,
you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Niall. Good morning, everybody. I won't talk for long, which should be a relief to many of you in the audience here. But I am going to add a little bit to the list of questions that Niall mentioned in his introduction. Something new, something that I've been concerned about. And my concern is that we haven't brought anybody to justice for Benghazi, to my knowledge. There's been no apprehensions, from what I can tell. There have been no arrests. There have been no military raids. There have been no drone strikes. Nothing as far as I can see or am aware of. Perhaps there are some things that have gone on, but I checked the news and been following this issue for a bit, and I have not seen anything so far. And it's troubling to me because we're moving on 21 or so months since the terrible attacks on Benghazi, on our diplomatic facilities there in Benghazi. It'll be 2 years this September. And I hope that the special committee will spend some of its time on this, in addition to the questions that Hans and Hella will talk about and Niall discussed in his introduction. I'm bothered by the fact that no one has been held to account for this for a couple of reasons. First, I think justice needs to be served for the terrorist acts against U.S. diplomats, citizens, and diplomatic facilities. And the other thing I'm very worried about as well is that what sort of signal does this appearance of U.S. passivity, whether it's actual or perceived, send to others who would do us harm? I understand that investigations can take time. There have been some, I believe, some indictments laid down. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll leave that up to the legal people. The State Department came out in January and identified Ansar al-Sharia as responsible for the attacks on the U.S. diplomatic facilities in Benghazi. Some individuals have been named as designated terrorists because of it. Maybe we don't have the intelligence to be able to get the right people. The FBI has put some pictures up on its website, hasn't said these individuals are responsible in its careful wording, but it says these people are of interest and the FBI would like to speak to them. And that website has been up, and I believe it's still active and shows 9 or 12 photos of individuals who were taken, pictures were taken on by surveillance cameras on the compound, the diplomatic compound. So I'm not quite sure why it's taken so long. I mean, I realize that Libya is a tough place right now. It's a place that's, especially Benghazi. We did undertake a raid recently against one of the terrorists responsible for the African bombings. That took place in Tripoli. There have been a special forces raid on a tanker off the coast of Libya. But I'm a little confused as to why we have not seen anybody brought to justice in any fashion, in my mind, since this terrible event took place 2 years ago. And I'm troubled by what I perceive as a lack of response. I mean, little is being said about this publicly, and maybe I understand why that could be. And from outward appearances, like I said, we're outside of the government. We don't have access to classified information. That little is being done. I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'm hoping this is something that the special committee will look into. I think perceptions really do matter. And maybe the special committee can explain to us why Ansar al-Sharia leaders like Ahmed Abu Khatala and Mohammed al-Zahawi seem to be hiding in plain sight. In fact, this weekend there was the news reported about how Zahawi was basically shaking his finger at the United States and threatening us once again if we were to become involved in any way in Libya. I'm worried that for whatever reason our lack of counterterrorism ops against Ansar al-Sharia is telling terrorists in Libya, and there are a lot of them, a lot of militia groups and a lot of them who don't like the United States and elsewhere, that they can strike U.S. interests with impunity. I know it took us as much as 10 years to bring Osama bin Laden to justice, but it didn't take us that long to start rounding up his cohorts, his 9/11 associates. That started immediately. Indeed, according to press reports, like I said, some of these individuals who may have been responsible for the attacks in Benghazi almost 2 years ago continue to threatening us. What the bigger picture is that I think we're struggling a bit with the war on terror. The State Department will tell you that terror attacks were up 43% last year. Syria, according to the Director of National Intelligence, has attracted some 7,000 foreign fighters from over 50 countries. Some of them have expressed the desire to attack the United States. There's also been testimony saying that there are training camps in Syria that are set up with the purpose of training terrorists to go back to their native lands and conduct terrorist attacks. There also may be Americans among them. There have been lots of press reports about numbers as high as 70 Americans participating in the fighting in Syria. Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups are proliferating. This is another concern, and this is the signal that we may be sending to those who would do us harm. Iraq is in turmoil, both from its own internal problems and also for what's happening next door in Syria. Boko Haram in Nigeria made headlines recently with the kidnapping of nearly 300 girls. Libya itself, as I mentioned, is awash with Islamist groups and maybe on the verge of civil war between themselves and other forces. We have Al-Shabaab in Somalia, recently responsible for a brazen mall attack that killed more than 60 people in Nairobi. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has Al-Qaeda's best bomb maker, al-Asiri. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb operates throughout North and West Africa. Egypt's Sinai is also a hotbed for terrorists. And there are questions about what happens in Pakistan after U.S. drone strikes end, and what happens in Afghanistan after U.S. forces withdraw. Some are worried about the old Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's core, reforming in places like Afghanistan or along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The point I'm trying to make is that the terror threat persists. We're in the crosshairs, and I'm worried that a lack of justice against the perpetrators of Benghazi is telling Al-Qaeda and others that they can attack us with impunity. We should not only be in the business of bringing terrorists to justice, but also in the business of deterring, dissuading, and denying them the opportunity to threaten U.S. interests. I hope the White House includes that notion in their new strategy, which the President alluded to in his speech at West Point just recently. It would be a good start in bringing the Benghazi terrorists to account. I also hope that the Special Committee on Benghazi will look into this matter and provide us with some answers regarding this in a fashion that doesn't undermine our national security. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter. Moving on now to Hans Wons-Bukowski.
Well, I'm sure you're wondering, what is a lawyer doing here on this panel? So my task is to explain a little bit about select committees and how they operate. If you look at Rule 10 of the 48 pages of the rules of the House of Representatives, that sets up the permanent committees that exist in the House. A select committee is a congressional committee set up to perform a special task, usually such as the investigation of a particular issue. Its powers, its duties, the number of its members are defined by the resolution that establishes its existence. The Speaker of the House is given the power to appoint such committees under Clause 11 of Rule 1 of the same House rules. In this case, a House resolution, H.R. 567, was passed on May 8th, and it set up the Select Committee to, quote, to investigate, quote, the events surrounding the 2012 terrorist attack in Benghazi. This is a copy of the resolution. It's about 7 pages. And it basically defines, as I said, all the powers and duties of the Select Committee. Now, usually, Select Committees end when they have completed their assigned task. But there are several Select Committees, actually, in the House and Senate that are permanent. One example is in the House, they have a Select Committee on Intelligence, which is a permanent committee. The Senate has the same type of committee. This Select Committee, according to its own resolution, will, quote, cease to exist 30 days after filing the final report. Now, one of the most well-known Select Committees, probably in the last 50 years, was one with a very innocuous title called the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, which was the committee that investigated President Nixon after the Watergate burglary. Another more infamous select committee, frankly, was the Church Committee, which was set up in the early 1970s, and which many people blame for emasculating and damaging our intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities to such an extent that we've never fully recovered, and there are some that blame that committee and those changes on the intelligence, some of the intelligence failures that led directly to 9/11. Now, the advantage of a select committee over one of the other permanent committees, and as all of you know, there have been several committees that have been trying to investigate the Benghazi terrorist attack, is that with a select committee, the staff that you put in place devotes 100% of its time to that issue. That is not the case with the other committees of Congress, which have many other responsibilities, both in the oversight area and with regard to formulating and reviewing legislation. Now, this resolution set up a committee of 12 members, of whom 5 are from the minority in the House. It sets up actually on 2 pages 9 different tasks that it's supposed to perform. Now, I'm not going to read all of those. You can look at them yourself, but I would note 3 of the 9. One of them is that they are supposed to investigate all policies, decisions, and activities to respond to and repel such attacks, including efforts to rescue U.S. personnel. And the committee is supposed to look at accountability for policies and decisions related to the security of facilities in Benghazi, Libya, and the response to the attacks, including individuals and entities responsible for those policies and those decisions, which of course gets to the heart of what Peter Brooks was talking about, which is finding out what were the security issues that existed, what was the response of the U.S. government, the State Department to them, and who was responsible for making those decisions, something that we really still don't know today. Now, the third and last purpose I would note for you is any other relevant issues relating to such attacks, the responses to them, or the investigation by the House into the attacks. That's basically what lawyers will tell you is a catch-all phrase that lets this committee look at absolutely anything related to the Benghazi attack. So it has a very, very broad mandate. Now, due to its constitutional oversight function, Congress is entitled to information and documents from the legislative branch that in some instances the public isn't entitled to. There are certain exceptions, for example, in the Freedom of Information Act, which apply to the public that don't apply to Congress. But one thing we know from recent documents that were obtained by Judicial Watch in a lawsuit that they filed is that they obtained through court order documents related to Benghazi that had not been turned over to Congress. So it's pretty clear that this committee has a lot ahead of it. Now, the chair of this committee, Trey Gowdy, is a former assistant United States attorney. That, frankly, is very important because it means he's a former prosecutor, and he has developed, in many prior instances, cases through investigation and then has conducted litigation in court. And that's very, very important in telling you whether this committee is going to have the ability to actually conduct its investigation effectively. Now, according to this resolution, he can issue subpoenas, he can order depositions under oath, and he can allow members of the committee to question witnesses for more than 5 minutes. Anyone who's familiar with how Congress works, I've testified before Congress, as have members of this committee, and I see some people in the audience who I recognize who have also testified in front of committees, know that normally members of Congress only have 5 minutes to question you. I can tell you it's pretty difficult for a member of Congress to get real answers from a reluctant witness with only 5 minutes. The other thing that's important here is the resolution says that the chair can allow staff to question witnesses. And that, again, is very key to being able to cross-examine witnesses effectively, particularly if they get some good staff members with prior prosecutorial experience. I'll also say, frankly, and this is not meant, this is not pointed to anyone directly in Congress, but many members of Congress really don't know how to question witnesses. You know, they think cross-examination consists of asking questions irately or crossly. And that is not how you do cross-examination. It's an acquired skill. It requires laying the groundwork, lulling a witness into a false sense of security, picking up on what the witness is saying, and following up on contradictions and conflicts, and insisting that they answer the question. You can't do that in 5 minutes, and you can't do that without great preparation and, frankly, prior skill and experience in doing that. Now, the key thing here, too, is that this committee will be able to, as I said, subpoena witnesses. And if they refuse to answer or refuse to appear, there are 2 federal statutes that apply to this, and I'll kind of end with this. 2 U.S.C. 192 is a federal statute that says that any witness summoned before a committee of the House or Senate who refuses to, quote, answer any question pertinent to the question under inquiry can be punished by a fine of up to $1,000 and up to a year in jail. The minimum being, by the way, a 1 month in jail. Now, under 2 U.S.C. 194, which is a statute that follows very closely after this, if a witness refuses to answer questions or to appear as a witness, such as, for example, Lois Lerner, who was recently held in contempt by the court, then what happens is the House or the Senate certify to the relevant United States attorney that a witness has refused to answer or appear before a committee. Now, in the case of Congress and the House, the relevant U.S. attorney is the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, a man named Ronald Macon. And under the statute, his duty shall be to bring the matter before the grand jury for its action. Now note that that statute doesn't say that the U.S. attorney may or may not bring that matter before a federal grand jury. It says that he shall. In other words, he has to do it. Unfortunately, the United States attorney for the District of Columbia has refused to follow the statute. For example, when the Attorney General, Eric Holder, was held in contempt of court, under this statute, he had a legal obligation to bring that contempt citation before a federal grand jury. He refused to do that. We don't know yet whether he's going to once again refuse to follow the law with regard to the Lerner contempt citation. But if he does refuse to do so, then it will not be a good sign for this committee. Because if there are any witnesses that refuse to answer questions or appear before it, and they refer this matter to the U.S. attorney, it'll be up to him to enforce it before a grand jury. And unfortunately, the lawlessness that has become prevalent in this Department of Justice, shown by the refusal of the U.S. attorney to comply with this federal statute, is a very serious concern, and one that, frankly, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, you should be worried about. To conclude, I'll just say that a select committee was long overdue with this. It has the power, it has the resources and the staff that's needed to try to investigate this and get to the bottom of the key questions that need to be answered. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hans. It's been really fascinating insights into the whole process.
Yeah, terrific.
Over to you, Helen.
Yeah, well, thank you. As Niall mentioned, it felt somehow to me, following U.S. public diplomacy as a heritage expert, to write about Benghazi when it happened. Ambassador Chris Stevens was in Benghazi to establish a diplomatic facility, a kind of consulate, and in part as a public diplomacy activity, which you don't normally think of public diplomacy, which is kind of a softer part of foreign policy, as landing in this kind of terrible trouble. But that was the case in Benghazi. So I started writing about it and have been following the issue ever since for the Heritage blog and other publications. And I was tremendously heartened when we finally did get the announcement of the House Select Committee, because watching a committee hearing after committee hearing and screaming at my television, ask a follow-up question, for goodness sake, becomes very tiresome. From one side, the Obama administration side, you hear, well, there are no more questions to be answered. You know, we've answered every question that we've been asked. All the information is out there. We put it all out. We've handed over thousands and thousands of documents. And well, yes, they have. It's like looking for needles in a haystack. Sometimes from the other side, of the aisle, you hear that no questions have been answered. Well, it's not quite true, actually. The committees have answered quite a few questions. But what you need all the time, as Hans mentioned, is you need the follow-up. You need the person who can then ask, well, okay, Secretary Panetta, you went to the president. You told him we were under attack. What did you recommend that we do? Nobody asked him that. Didn't you come in with 3 recommendations? Who would dare face the U.S. president and say, we're under attack? And not say, and this is Secretary of Defense, what I recommend we do. These are the resources we have, and this is what we would do. Well, he was sitting there in front of a Senate committee, and nobody thought to pose that. So I was very, very encouraged, and I think at least we can get a fair distance of the way in getting a picture of what happened in Benghazi. Trey Gowdy is a great choice. And the committee has announced that its first order of business will be trying to establish a timeline. Well, I think there should be actually 2 timelines, and they would have to merge at some level. The timeline of what exactly happened in Benghazi and the timeline of what exactly happened in Washington. And then we'll try to fit them both together. And the first thing they need to do is start not at the top, where they're likely to get people maybe refusing those subpoenas, but at the bottom. Ask the people who were in Benghazi at the time, who were at the CIA annex and at the U.S. diplomatic facility, what they saw, what happened, who was there, what was their personal experience, and then also, as a follow-up, what did the Obama administration tell you when you came home about sharing those experiences with the congressional committees? Because they have stated that they were, some were never questioned, some were very much discouraged from coming forward. That would be some of the security staff, and others who have come forward have been punished for doing so, have been sidelined, denied promotions, denied basically professional activity after that. And then what the committee needs to do, maybe in an act of it's a mental exercise, try to disregard what has been written about it and what has been the narrative that was created in Washington afterwards, the narrative that was created by the Obama administration. Try to disregard that and just focus on what the people who were there and who knew what they're telling you, because what they would tell is the truth. And personally, I was amazed that we did not get any of that after the attack itself took place. There were no newspaper interviews, there were no television interviews, there were no interviews with anyone who was from there. It was like they had all dropped off the face of the earth. Hopefully, they will now get a chance to tell their story, maybe behind closed doors, and that's fine, as long as that story gets to members of Congress. I want to focus on 4 sets of issues that I think the committee needs to talk about, needs to dig into. Why was Chris Stevens in Benghazi in mid-September of 2012? Why indeed? Well, he was there to open a diplomatic facility, but why did we need a diplomatic facility there? It was an area rife with terrorist activity, as Peter mentioned, where several other countries had pulled out their posts, and the Red Cross was under attack. I mean, you know, this was the flag of Al-Qaeda was flying over government buildings. This was a dangerous area. Well, Chris Stevens, when he accepted the ambassadorship in May of 2012, was tasked by Secretary Clinton to open a facility in Benghazi. It was one of her top priorities. she wanted us to be out there. Benghazi is in some ways much more of a Libyan center of culture and politics than Tripoli. And it was certainly the center of the uprising against Gaddafi. And he was asked to produce a report on Benghazi security, which was due on September the 30th. That is why he had apparently been putting this task off, but and he clearly did not choose well when he chose the weekend of September the 11th, or the week of September 11th. It was a Tuesday, as far as I recall, to go there. But he did. He went with 2 security people because the security staff had been cut by the State Department and the Defense Department from 30 down to 9, and 2 was all they could afford him for personal protection. That left 7 in Tripoli to guard the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli. Now think about that. Hillary Clinton wants us in Benghazi. Libya is a high priority for the administration, and security staff is cut. It does not compute at all. Stevens was against this, and in fact had on several, as we all know from his cables, occasions argued against cutting the staff. But he had been overruled. So was the previous ambassador. And the military security detail was transferred from embassy security to training of Libyan forces. So they were not actually available anymore. In any event, he went. He was the best connected, the best expert they had. I mean, Ambassador Stevens was really the man of the moment in Libya. He knew the country so well and had the connections in Benghazi to go and talk to them about how bad the security situation really was. Now, there was connection between the State Department and the embassy in Tripoli for weeks before his trip, talking about what he was going to do. And yet, for some reason, when we got to the Accountability Review Board, which was set up by Clinton to investigate all what was going on, they stated in writing that he went independently of Washington. He went there just to take a look on his own. It is, you know, this in spite of the fact that they were given the information. So there was a whole area there of Libya policy, of Hillary Clinton's plans, her intentions, that has not been delved into at all. And as a matter of fact, her book, you know, which is just out again, it probably does not mention this either. There was a trip, she was planning a trip to Tripoli herself that fall, which should make all of this a pretty high priority for the ambassador, and it was. He was acting on her behalf. Well, I'm sorry to say that she certainly was not acting on his behalf when the attack came down. She was informed of the attack within minutes of it happening. She was informed in person, over the phone, that this was happening, that the consulate was under attack. She was not informed that there was a demonstration about a video going on. At the same time, though, if you go back and look at her press release, which came out that same evening, she stated that there was this heinous video out there and people in Benghazi were upset about it, and some of that might have fed into this demonstration that was going on. Well, no, there was no demonstration, and everybody who was there knew it. So, Hillary Clinton's role, Ambassador Stevens' mission, is one that we need, and the Libya policy overall is one that we really need to hear much more about. The reason to downgrade the diplomatic forces there, I mean the security forces, absolutely needs to be dug into. This was very much done in disregard of the requests from Ambassador Stevens. And again, if you look at the AIB report, it says that he turned down twice the offer from the Defense Department to extend their security forces. Well, he didn't actually, because they had already shifted them from his control over to a training mission. And for diplomatic reasons, this was creating a problem. But there was no effort made to accommodate his concerns. And what really troubles me, I mean, one of the things that troubles me about the Accountability Review Board's report, which is referred to all the time by the administration, is that it does, I mean, it subtly lays the blame over on the victim. Ambassador Stevens went there on his own. He did not want more security. He was in control. Well, he wasn't actually. I mean, he was not actually in control. He was trying to do the best he could to do his job, but under very, very difficult circumstances. And the fact that Hillary Clinton and Undersecretary Patrick Kennedy, who was actually the man who ultimately turned down the security requests, were never interviewed. Well, the people who were headed the board, the Accountability Review Board report, Ambassador Pickering and Ambassador Admiral Mullen, I mean, they heard of this. They were also, I'm sure, very well connected to Hillary Clinton herself. They were not people who would necessarily want to hang her out to dry, I don't think. I mean, in Washington, people mix very easily, and I doubt that they would want that. But so I hope that that report, very faulty as it was, very insufficient, will be taken to pieces. Now let's see. Was there evidence that there was an attack on the embassy? Another area that the Select Committee will be looking at. How did the story of the video and the attack, the demonstration turning into attack, emerge? The administration, Susan Rice, when she went on the talk shows the following Sunday morning, categorically stated that this was a demonstration or a video that turned into an attack. She said that 5 times. Well, the talking points she was given, which we know were created as a collaboration between the CIA, the State Department, and the White House, never mentioned the demonstration. It mentioned the demonstration, but not the video. The story of the video, the first one to mention that was Hillary Clinton herself. The demonstration, that idea came from the CIA, whose in hearings, from what we know, had various accounts of what happened on the ground. Some accounts said there was a demonstration, some said there was an attack, and Mike Morrell, who was the acting director at the time, said we're going with a demonstration. The White House would like us to point away from, and the White House said they wanted to point away from a policy failure and towards a demonstration gone awry. Now that's then ballooned into this big narrative of that was perpetuated by President Obama and Secretary Clinton, even to the point of Obama going to the United Nations talking about how videos, anti-Muslim videos, are not an American tradition and we don't approve of those at all. Completely irrelevant to what happened. But the administration was crafting a narrative, clearly with a view to exert damage control before the presidential election. The committee will need to dig into specifically how these talking points were created, and has referred to one set of them, which came out as a result of the Judicial Watch's FOIA request, which showed us from National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, that he would like this not to show a policy failure in Libya, but to show that there was an uproar about this video created in America. So it was really the fault of people back here, and I think that was one of the reasons that John Boehner eventually decided on having a select committee, because it showed that the administration did not turn over documents when they were requested And this document had been requested before by Congress and not handed over. It took a legal action to excavate it. And finally, I think the committee will have to be very sensitive to the subtle and not so subtle threats that were made against people who wanted to come forward with their testimony. They all suffered personal attacks, character assassination, and professional consequences. Closed-door hearings will certainly be best, but they need to tell us why it was that within the State Department and the CIA, they were severely discouraged from bringing their testimony forward. This is a terrible miscarriage of justice, adding insult to injury, and they certainly deserve some restitution for what happened to them. But they need the assurance that they can speak freely. And then, of course, the lack of the retaliation Peter mentioned, the lack of a military response at the time, which the Armed Services Committee in the House has not quite gotten to why that there was no such response. There are still people questioning whether we could have made an effort. General Lowell, not very long ago, in very emotional testimony, stated that we should have made an attempt. He was the intelligence officer in AFRICOM who was watching this from the aerial drone that was sent overhead. It was the only thing we ever sent. The aerial non-armed drone that was flying over Libya anyway was directed so we could have some real-time video of what was happening on the ground. No other military force from outside of Libya managed to get there in time to be of any assistance whatsoever. I mean, just think how different things could have been. Even if somebody had been able to arrive at the CIA annex, which was a mile down the road and which was attacked in the morning, whereas the diplomatic facility was attacked in the evening. So the following morning, maybe somebody could have gotten there, spared 2 American lives, and chased off the people who were attacking them. Maybe captured some of them, who knows? Could have been a very different scenario. So we need to hear more about that too. I could go on and on and on. I have so many questions. And people who tell you that they've all been answered, they are just not telling you the truth. And I'm going to stop talking now so you can get to ask some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Helle. A lot of terrific unanswered questions that you've outlined there with regard to what is a very, very big scandal, frankly one that's just growing bigger. Now I'd like to invite questions from the audience for our panel. Please do identify yourself and any affiliation you might have, and I'd like to kick off with the questions. This gentleman here.
Yeah, I'm Joe Kaufman. I'm Joe Kaufman with Congressman Bridenstine's office in the House. Question for Mr. Spikowski. What recourse exists if U.S. Attorney Macon refuses to follow the statute that you referred to and bring uncooperative witnesses before a grand jury?
What should happen is what happened with the Attorney General. The House held the Attorney General in contempt. The U.S. Attorney refused to comply with the federal statute. So the House of Representatives hired its own lawyers, and they are in court right now trying to get a federal judge to enforce that contempt citation. Now, there's been a long fight going on because after the contempt citation, as you all probably recall, the President asserted executive privilege with regard to the documents that the Attorney General was refusing to turn over. They could do that again in this situation, but I frankly think the House of Representatives should go ahead right now and appropriate the money needed to hire private counsel to enforce any contempt citations against any witnesses that refuse to answer questions. And unless the administration wants to claim executive privilege with regard to any and all of those witnesses, those enforcements should move much faster. Because in those enforcements, if the administration isn't coming in and saying, well, there's a reason why this witness isn't testifying or not answering questions, then they ought to actually be able to get pretty quick resolution from a federal judge. And what will happen there is, if a federal judge can order the person put in jail until they answer the questions.
Hans, how does that affect documents in terms of executive privilege? So you're talking about individuals answering questions, but what sort of powers does the special committee have in terms of documentation?
Well, I mean, they've got, I mean, look, they have the same power that Congress has to get a hold of, frankly, any document. The only kind of document that the legislative branch has the ability really to withhold from Congress are things covered by executive privilege.
So
Okay?
anything,
Even, as you all know, I mean, a great example is in the area where you used to work directly, and that is classified materials. If you're a member of the public, obviously you cannot get classified materials through a Freedom of Information Act request. But Congress has the ability to get those kind of documents. They have committees that are specifically set up, these permanent select committees. They have special rooms where they can look at these kind of classified documents. That's a good example of how Congress has the constitutional authority to get documents that the public does not. And unless the president asserts executive privilege of some kind to cover any of the documents that this committee wants to get on the Benghazi case, the administration has an obligation to turn it over.
but that's certainly a possibility, right?
It is, yeah, it is a possibility. We know they put in a very broad claim of executive privilege on all the documents related to Operation Fast and Furious, because that's what the contempt citation to the Attorney General was about.
Does that include the President's diary, which is a document that people have been talking about here?
Well, yeah, very well. He could, yes. Anything directly, I mean, it's much easier for the president to assert executive privilege with regard to documents in the White House, exchanges with close aides. It gets a little more brittle when that executive privilege claim starts going down into the executive branches. The further you get from the president, the tougher it is to make an executive privilege claim stick. And an important issue here is to remember is that you know, what's going on in court right now is a federal judge is looking at whether the executive privilege claim that was made by the president with regard to Operation Fast and Furious, whether it is legitimate. Now, the Justice Department actually filed a motion to dismiss this lawsuit, saying that this was a political question and that the courts had no business determining the legitimacy of the president's executive privilege claim. The judge threw out that motion in a rather curt order in which they said, well, I'm sorry, but this issue was decided 30 years ago when Richard Nixon tried to make that claim, and the courts decided no, they have the ability to make a decision on the legitimacy of an executive privilege claim.
Question over there.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Mike Doherty with LabMD from Atlanta. About the media circus and getting the American public's attention on this, we finally have what we consider maybe a media bias against covering Benghazi, and then 60 Minutes does it. It boils down to a bit of a fiasco. And that, to me, feeds into the administration's agenda of circling and confusing and draining people's attention dry, and then just sort of falls by the wayside. How are we going to reinvigorate a broad media attention to this without anything else?
I think question for Hella Dale.
Well, that is a really good question because Fox News has been on this case from the beginning and done a terrific job. As you mentioned, CBS took a pretty good stab at it in that 60-minute report, but they flubbed some of it, and poor Lara Logan got completely eviscerated as a consequence. The journalist there in question. I think I would encourage the committee, the select committee, to acquire some really expert communication staff, because I think that will really be key. You need that. They will need to be able to work with reporters from the main media to reach out to them in a fairly sophisticated way to make sure that the right bits of the story get out at the right time to the right people. We will be banging the drum here at the Heritage Foundation in our Daily Signal blog, in publications, in programs like this. And we are very, very grateful when people cover those and they get seen around the country. But you know, even with the kind of very desultory coverage and very, in some ways, very biased coverage we've seen of Benghazi by the mainstream media, there is, in the American people, a great distrust of the story that has been peddled by the Obama administration. You know, I've spoken to so many audiences about this issue, and people are inflamed about it. They really are. And it's a fairly broad spectrum of people. This is not just Republicans. People do see that this is as a huge issue, a huge scandal, if you really actually sit down and talk about it for a bit and let them express their views. And we have polls also, I mean, opinion polling more broadly that suggests this. So I'm just hoping that reaching out and persuading some of the reporters from the big newspapers, even if you work for the mainstream media, if you're a good reporter, if somebody really waves a good story in front of your nose, it's very hard to resist it. I really believe that. And I hope we can get the word out.
Most of the deliberations won't be public, though, right? I mean, this will be done essentially in private. It'll be that's where it really differs from a committee hearing, is that there will be, and I imagine they will have a press secretary, but
yeah,
it's possible the chairman could agree to hold off on saying anything until the end of everything is done and the report is issued. I'm not sure if there's anything in the legislation that talks about that or if there have been any agreements, but my understanding is that this will be different from a hearing, committee hearing, in that deliberations will be done in private.
So from what I understand, that is true, but I expect that towards the end of this there will be, well, there'll certainly be a report.
Yes.
And there will also probably be some public hearings, maybe as you get further into the investigation.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing people should understand is they should not expect that there's going to be any kind of public hearings anytime soon, because that's not the most effective way for this committee to do its job. The most effective way for the committee to do its job is to hire a staff of good lawyers with prosecutorial experience, who then start subpoenaing all the witnesses they believe are necessary to start answering questions, and frankly having closed-door depositions of those witnesses, intense depositions where the witnesses can be cross-examined as much as possible. And as was said earlier, you start with the people who are on the ground in Libya, and then you work from there up to the top of the State Department and the Pentagon. I mean, I don't want to compare this to a mob operation or a drug cartel, but look, when the Justice Department goes after and investigates those kind of organizations, you start with witnesses at the bottom and you work your way up. Because as you get information and documentation from these witnesses, you can use that to then confront the people above them and the people above them to find contradictory statements, to find conflicts, to find things that frankly are not true. And doing this behind closed doors is the way to do this. And that includes, by the way, any witness who says, well, I work at the State Department, but I was told if I talk to you, there are going to be severe consequences. The very next person subpoenaed should be the individual who was that person's supervisor who told them there were going to be severe consequences to them for talking to the committee. That's the next person who is subpoenaed to come over and have their deposition taken. That is the way you do an effective investigation. Now, at the end, yeah, you should have public hearings to present what you found, maybe to have the best witnesses who've come forward with honest information, but from now until they get well into the investigation, you won't be hearing much in the press if they do it that way.
Just to follow up, Hella, with regard to the media coverage of this, and bearing in mind your own experience in Europe and the UK as well, Is there a big difference between how the press would be covering this in Britain, for example, and the United States? I mean, is there a sort of more of a culture of deference here in America towards the White House, towards politicians? It's easy, for example, to imagine in London a foreign secretary or senior government minister has been forced to resign over a scandal like this. But we haven't seen a single State Department official so far held to account.
No, I mean, there are four lower-level State Department officials who were had some professional disciplinary, or put on administrative leave or something like that, but nothing further has been done than that. I think you're right, Niall. I mean, Fleet Street has a famous tradition for digging in its teeth into the British government and keeping at it, and I would certainly think that if this was a British scandal, we would have seen it treated differently. I do think so. I mean, think back to the Iraq War, and there were some scandals there in Britain which blew wide open. But it's true. It's been quite differential, and unfortunately so.
And didn't Secretary Kerry immediately restore those 4 individuals to their...
Yeah, I think you're right. Yes.
I have a question for Hans. I mean, I want to go back to this executive privilege thing. If the Congress subpoenas individuals from the executive office of the president, generally the rule has been that these people, because of the confidentialities that take place between the president and his staff, they do not require congressional nomination or consent to be in those positions. Because having worked on the Hill and seen some of these sort of committees in the past, not having served on them myself, but been around them, there's going to be a tension between allowing these people to come and testify before Congress or before this committee and exerting executive privilege. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's going to be a critical issue here. And I don't know if there's any precedent along these lines in terms of the willingness of individuals to be allowed to. Because I imagine, and I don't know if the committee has to have agreement on both sides of the aisle for who they subpoena. That there isn't. So what happens then? I mean, if they do go and ask for individuals, say, out of the press office, and want them to come and testify, for instance, about the narrative that was presented to the American people by Susan Rice, how do you see that sort of thing playing out? And how does the president exert or invoke executive privilege?
Well, he sends again, going back to Operation Fast and Furious, a letter gets sent to Congress saying, I claim executive privilege with regard to, and then describes what that is. Well, I can tell you from my experience at the Justice Department, where I worked for 4 years, I mean, the Justice Department has always taken the position that, it's middle management people and up can appear before Senate and House committees. Now, they've always taken the position that we're not going to allow line attorneys to appear because that will interfere with what they do. But there have been instances in the past where Congress has insisted on getting testimony from particular individuals, and they have agreed to do that. This committee, as I said, has a very broad mandate. I mean, they have 9 different things they're supposed to look at, and the last one is basically a catch-all that lets them look at almost anything connected with this, including, and this is important, that they've been asked to make any legislative recommendations that they believe are necessary to be sure this kind of thing does not happen again. And I think that gives them a very broad spectrum of what they can look at. And if the administration wants to prevent specific testimony by specific individuals, they're going to have to come up with a good reason to do that. I think if that happens, the committee needs to immediately publicize that, because the administration needs to take responsibility for what it's doing, and particularly with regard to documents, they will have to exercise executive privilege in writing and tell Congress specifically which documents it doesn't intend to turn over and why it's not turning them over. And by the way, if they end up in a lawsuit with them, one of the things that the House will be able to do is ask for what's called a privilege log. When one side says the documents do not have to be turned over, one thing that courts require is what's called a privilege log. That's a list of all the documents by name, the dates, the people who were involved, and usually like a one-line description of what's in it, so that the judge can make a decision as to whether or not it really is a privileged document, and the other side knows at least what to ask for, even if they're not getting the substantive nature of the document. And I can tell you, oftentimes privilege logs can give you some pretty interesting clues as to what it is that the other side doesn't want you to see.
What sort of information would be in a privilege log?
Well, like I said, it'll be a description of a complete description of all documents that have been or asserted or being asserted that they can be withheld. So, for example, if there is a email from the White House to a State Department official that they are withholding, the privilege log would have to identify it, saying who it's from, who it went to, the date, and some kind of brief description what the subject matter of the email, again, so that the other side can try to dispute or make any claims they want to before a judge as to whether or not that really is a privileged document.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi, J.C. Derrick with World Magazine. Dr. Brooks, you mentioned the idea of no justice for the perpetrators of the attacks. So I'm just curious, can you talk about what reasoning, your thoughts on, do you think it's more on the part of the administration, do they have ulterior motives, or is there incompetence? What would be the reasoning for nothing?
Yeah, I guess, justice is defined a number of different ways, and there's a number of people, I think, that are interested in justice, whether you're talking about family members or colleagues or the American people, for the destruction and taking of human life that took place at Benghazi. There's even, I'm sure, a legal definition of it. I think it should be swift and it should be proportionate. I think that's critically important. And as I mentioned, I'm really worried about the signal that we're sending to others, since it appears that these individuals who are responsible for this are living with impunity at the moment. Now, you're right. That's a very interesting question, and I guess only the administration can really answer that question. But I'll give you some potential thoughts for it. I mean, perhaps the investigation is still ongoing in terms of who is in particular is responsible for this. The administration took over a year to put Ansar al-Sharia on its terrorism list and named particular individuals, such as Hatala, as a designated terrorist. You definitely want to take action against the right people, the people who are responsible for that. So that's a possibility. I don't know, and I'm hoping the committee will look at some of these questions. Another possibility is the political situation in Libya. I think it would be very much of a stretch to try to say that the Libya operation militarily was successful, has been a success overall. Any reading of the press recently shows that the country is in complete turmoil. There are maybe hundreds of militia groups. There are terrorist organizations. I think there's a dispute between the administration and others as to whether groups like Ansar al-Sharia are affiliated with al-Qaeda or not. Or whether they just embrace al-Qaeda's ideology. We've seen a number of groups come in and out of al-Qaeda over the years. But there's certainly, I think there's animus towards the United States from some of these groups, and that's the reason they're on our terrorist list. There isn't much of a functioning government in Libya. There is a government in Tripoli. There's potential for civil war now between other forces and these militias. It's my understanding that when they snatched al-Libi, who was responsible for the Africa bombings, an al-Qaeda operative, off the streets, I think it was last September, that the Libyan government was very unhappy about that this was the takedown of Ansar al-Sharia, or the individuals responsible for the attack on the Benghazi consulate, was going to be done by the Libyans or with the Libyans. But there isn't, my sense is that there isn't much of an organization or structure or capability within Libya today to be able to undertake something along these lines without major intervention of U.S. forces, special operations forces, or intelligence officers, or law enforcement. So it could be the concern that if there were a major operation by the United States, whether it's a drone strike or an apprehension, that could lead to making the government even more fragile, or bring it down entirely, or create more chaos. I mean, like once again, these are just possibilities. You'd have to ask the administration. It's possible also in terms of the investigation that there's just a lack of intelligence out there. Tripoli is different from Benghazi. Benghazi is, I would say that the intelligence environment is probably not very permissive. It's very dangerous for Americans, as I think we saw witnessed 2 years ago in Benghazi, and I think in some ways it may even be worse. So maybe we don't have the intelligence to support that. So they're having difficulty fingering, although we've seen these people on the FBI website. I'm having a hard time, not being a law enforcement individual, reading between the lines on this, on these individuals who are pictured. The FBI says they would like, maybe Hans could say something about that, maybe he knows something about it, but they say these people are of interest because they have their pictures, we'd like to talk to them. I mean, that's kind of what it says. It's very, very unique language that I'm sure has more meaning than I'm able to divine from it. So they have an idea, but other than the fact that maybe they just got these individuals' pictures taken on surveillance cameras that were recovered from Benghazi. Another possibility is that maybe operational planning is ongoing. You know, like as I said at the end of my talk, I don't want the special committee to say anything publicly that would undermine our ability to bring these people to justice. I would like them to look into it. Most of these proceedings, as I understand, will be behind closed doors. I'm sure classified information will be discussed, and I don't want to do anything that would prevent them from looking into this, and I don't want them to disclose anything that would undermine our ability to do that. So those are a couple of the reasons that are possible. Once again, this is known by, and I would like somebody really to ask the administration about this. Why, after almost 2 years, we haven't brought these people to justice. And it could be any number of these things, and they may be reluctant to say something about it. Then there's other possible reasons out there as well, including political ones. But once again, I don't know what's going on. I think it's something that I would like to know about, as long as it doesn't undermine our national security. So those are some of the thoughts. But once again, I'm really worried. I think we're in a very difficult environment today in terms of terrorism. The government is willing to say that they're very concerned about what's going on in Syria. They're very concerned about the proliferation of these Al-Qaeda affiliate groups or violent Islamists who may have America in the crosshairs. So I'm worried about not having sent a signal that an attack on an American embassy and the taking of American lives is something that may go unpunished. But once again, I'm willing to hope that something is going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of, and that ultimately and soon these individuals who are responsible for this terrible tragedy will be held to account.
Definitely sets a very, very dangerous precedent for future possible attacks on U.S. embassies and U.S. facilities abroad.
Another thing is, I mean, some people have said over the years about terrorists, especially Islamist terrorists, that they can't be deterred. I don't necessarily believe this, especially their leaders. And I think this is, found in the fact that Osama bin Laden hid out for, 10 years. He didn't come out. He wasn't out fighting. He was. Who knows where he was between 2001 and 2000 and his demise. I don't believe that some of them cannot be deterred, certainly dissuaded or denied. And so I think it's incredibly important that justice be served. And of course, it depends on how you define justice. But I think that showing that you cannot attack American diplomatic facilities, take American lives, and destroy American property with impunity.
Absolutely. And just a final question before we close the panel. With regard to Hillary Clinton, of course, the stakes very high for her with the whole Benghazi investigation. Do you think that she's going to be very, very cooperative with this investigation, or is she going to try and shy away? How do you see Hillary Clinton actually handling what is potentially an explosive issue for her at a very sensitive time? Do you think she's going to be, confronting her, her critics head on, or is she going to try and largely ignore the Benghazi issue?
Well, I think her book, which is supposed to be coming out here on June the 10th, and which Politico gave us a little preview of, suggests that she's going to be on the counterattack. That, her opening statement in the chapter on Benghazi is that she's not going to, make any political hay on the back of dead men. And when you consider her own potential role in this in the State Department, the mind sort of boggles. But she has expressed in a couple of different occasions that she regrets what happens. Well, who doesn't regret it? But she has at no point suggested that she is willing to take responsibility for it. And I very much think that she will probably try as hard as she can not to cooperate with the committee, or at least to do so in a very limited fashion. And I think that's why the Democrats actually, in the end, agreed to be on the committee, so that she would have a little posse on her side there.
Right. And Hans, do you see Hillary Clinton actually any evidence of this?
Well, I don't I don't know what her attitude will be of cooperating or not. The one thing I'll say about that from a legal standpoint is that it's much easier to subpoena a former government official than a current government official. So once she stepped down from being Secretary of State, that opened her up in a way that basically got rid of all the protections that current high officials of the government have in avoiding testifying before Congress.
Right. So it's going to be an interesting few months ahead. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and thank you very much to our distinguished panel for an excellent series of remarks. Thank you.